Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. Today we're going to be talking about Governor Inslee's decision that it is no longer your body or your choice if you work for state government, and the ramifications of this policy and how it may affect the rest of us who live in Washington State. Okay, we're back to Washington State, and of course we are living in the lockdown era, where basically Washington State for the last 18 months has had one variety or another of an emergency proclamation from Governor Inslee that doesn't seem to ever stop or ever come to an end. And it doesn't matter whether it's permanent mask mandates, whether it's requirements to take a vaccine, whether it's shutting your businesses down or some other small manipulation of daily life. Governor Inslee's endless lockdown seems to be with us. And of course, everything I'm going to be saying today is not approved by the Ministry of COVID Compliance in Washington State. So believe me, I don't know if they're going to censor this, but if they do, you'll know why, because it's certainly not an approved message. Now, remember, we had a lot of movement over the last many years, this idea of my body, my choice, right? There's been protests. It's largely viewed as kind of a feminist movement in our country and around the world about, hey, if it's my body, it's my choice, what I get to do with it. However, in Washington State, what we have seen now is based on Governor Inslee's recent proclamations and claims that anybody who works for the state of Washington, if you don't get vaccinated, you will lose your job, you'll be fired. That effort and that policy, which has been approved by the Ministry of COVID Compliance and Inslee's entire control over all the state agencies, that policy is actually generating quite a bit of ripples and anger in many workers who do work for the state of Washington. In fact, recently, just a few weeks ago, over 1,000 people showed up at the Capitol, along with numerous other rallies and protests around the state of people who work for the state and all the state agencies, whether it's Department of Ecology, Corrections, L&I, DSHS, or teachers, and they have been very angry and disappointed with this approach. And in fact, it's kind of part of a variety of protests that have been going on all around the state of Washington now, pushing back against permanent mask mandates on children in school and lockdowns in schools as well, along with CRT protest, critical race theory protests, and other issues that are not making parents happy about what their kids are experiencing in the public school system, in the government-run school system today. Also, these pushbacks are coming from state workers who are also angry that they no longer have autonomy over their own body, and that the governor is going to come and tell them that they must take this jab or that jab. One of the concerns here, of course, is a slippery slope. Today it's this particular vaccine, and who knows what it'll be tomorrow, but they're setting a dangerous precedent where they're basically coming in and dictating every little element of your medical future and whatever the governor gets to decide for you rather than your doctor or anybody else. Now, of course, these protests are not approved by the Ministry of COVID Compliance. Nothing these people are saying or doing is making anybody happy in government, and so there's a lot of anger that anybody dare question what's going on. And this, of course, is raising concerns about what the heck is Governor Inslee doing? Why did anybody think that he would relinquish any of his power and control once he felt like he had a compliant and supple and relatively spineless legislature who were going to support what he's going to do? And of course, there were lots of opportunities for mischief when something like this is going on. And the big question that has gone on around the state for a long time is exactly who is running Governor Inslee's COVID compliance, COVID-19 policies. They seem random, they seem all over the map. Science is an afterthought and an excuse, not actually determining anything when it comes to the policy that he's using. But of course, does Inslee really care? And does he need to care? I mean, that's a bigger problem. Inslee doesn't seem to care about the consequences of the damage that his policies actually have on regular people all around the state. And that is part of, I think, what's generating a lot of this pushback. And you're seeing these rallies and events going on everywhere, all over Washington State, Cowlitz County, Olympia, Bellingham, Eastern Washington, everywhere. Partially, too, because they're starting to trickle down to local government, and some local governments are following those mandates. Now, one of the problems has been that when Inslee has implemented some of these policies in the past, they've defied rational thought, where basically they're releasing violent felons into the community and saying, hey, you might get COVID, so we're going to release you there. Oh, and by the way, let's also defund the police and let's make sure public safety is a low priority. And at the same time, throw the full force and weight of the government against small business owners who dare to defy Governor Inslee. That is a high priority. Riots in the street, no problem. Burning the city down, no problem. Creating a sense of total lawlessness, especially in the Puget Sound region, no problem. But boy, if you violate Inslee's edicts, they're going to throw the full force of the government at you. Now, of course, Inslee can't do this without some help from his friends. He needs a lot of help actually to implement the worst of his policies and to make sure that the state throws its full force against them. I've covered some of these stories in the past, but it takes AG Bob Ferguson, the Attorney General for Washington State, to join with Inslee and support him in this mission. Ferguson doesn't care about your freedom or your rights or the state constitution at all. He's just primarily involved in ensuring that he goes after florists and small business owners and water parks and gyms all across the state of Washington, of course, and the hairdressers too, and anybody else that they think is small enough that he can beat up on, but not big enough to push back. That seems to be the primary profile. And if you can throw a few conservative activists in there at the same time, along the way, more power to him. And meanwhile, he'll ignore all real crime or real significant problems in the state. And unfortunately, you got to have somebody like Bob Ferguson working with a governor like Jay Inslee in order to pull off this kind of situation. There's no check and balance at all in the state of Washington, and they have a compliant Supreme Court that's mostly been appointed by Inslee or previous Democrat governors, so the Supreme Court's fairly useless at doing anything to uphold our freedoms and our rights as well. Now, when you also see this combination, this is why people oftentimes view this governor and the AG as working hand in hand. Anything that Governor Inslee's doing is deemed defended by the Attorney General, and anything the Attorney General is doing, Governor Inslee supports. And so they work pretty well together as a team. Now he's not the only person. You also look at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and the superintendent there is Chris Reichtel. And Chris has been very adamant about going as aggressive as possible on masking children, extending the longest lockdown he can get away with the kids, pushing critical race theory and sexual orientation theory and all kinds of other stuff that he's pushing into the system. Nobody's going to fail. Everybody passes. Everybody's a winner. So standards are dropped, and it just is creating a lot of blowback in the government-run school system right now, which is why you also see a lot of school boards with a lot of challengers. Parents are starting to wake up to some of the problems, and that we do not have serious people in charge, and what they're serious about isn't your kid's education. It's whatever political policy it is that they're trying to push. Now, part of this comes from just this lack of attachment to reality that our elites, our political elites in the state live in. They do not have much attachment to the real world. I don't see them being affected by the high crime rates that are going up in Kent or Renton or Tukwila or Federal Way right now, for example. They don't have to see the big homeless camps and the drug addiction problems that are spreading all around the state, even with the nicknamed Camp Inslee right across from the governor's mansion, across from Capitol Lake. They just get to ignore this and pretend like that's the little people's problem. They'll throw cash at it because it's a grant grifting opportunity for their friends, but they are not attached to the day-to-day impact that happens from their policies. They get to look at it very dismissively and just write it off as a bunch of us hicks in the sticks who are actually caring about whether we have businesses, the ability to send our kids to schools that function, or live in safety at home when the police budgets are being cut and money's being kicked back to all kinds of other situations. So this lack of attachment and this elitism really leads to some of this policy stuff, which is why you see a lot of pushback. Last year it started, and there were some very large rallies pushing back, and people were very angry and frustrated. And people don't necessarily know how to do this in the most effective way, but rallying and organizing protests is a fairly common way to do it. If you're on the left, usually you want to burn the city down and destroy buildings and break windows. But if you're not in the Antifa kind of world or the Evergreen State College training program, usually you don't want to start fires and burn buildings down. And instead, you actually want to push back in a more productive way, and you don't believe in doing it any other way. And the one thing people have to realize is that Governor Inslee isn't going to admit the truth about what he's doing or the damage that he's causing to the state. That's just not something that a politician's ever going to do. He's not going to admit the truth. He's not going to do it unless he's absolutely forced to. And right now, because of the weak nature of the legislature and the basically the fact that nobody's really willing to push back, he's able to get away with quite a bit. And whoever imagined that this would be the governor who would turn everyone into armed homeschool preppers? And yet the policies of reducing public safety, destroying the school system, and creating a lot of fear in the environment is really driving people towards these types of decisions, just based on the firearm purchases, based on our people that are pulling kids out of the public school system, trying to homeschool them, or at least pushing back on their local public school board, and stockpiling at home because they can't tell what is happening and where things are going. Living in fear is quite the way to do things. And you got to remember that Inslee started out as a slip and fall attorney, and that's the background on this governor. He started out taking advantage of people who were harmed and trying to get a cut of whatever payout he could convince somebody to get. That's his background. And now suddenly we find him as the de facto king of Washington State. Governor is the title, but with a weak and nearly impotent legislature right now, it doesn't seem like there's any end to this endless lockdown process. And so he's taken advantage of it quite a bit. But in order to have significant power and retain this power as he moves forward, he must ensure that everybody lives in a perpetual state of fear, endless fear. This is really what it's all about. Because if he can keep you scared and keep you convinced that the end of the world is nigh and that you have to do whatever he tells you to do and that there's no way to resist him, then that's going to be the message that gets out there. This is what the COVID compliance message is from Governor Inslee. And this produces a lot of problems. However, I think what people have to remember is that we can't live a life of any consequence if we're going to continue to live a life of fear, the life of fear that our governor and our elected officials and the bureaucrats want us to live. If it's not the Delta variant, it's going to be the Lambda variant or the soon-to-be-announced Omega Death variant. And once they run out of Greek letters, they're going to basically try to go to Fraternity Row and add up a bunch together to come up with some kind of new variant, and the variants are going to never end. The reality is we're living with COVID now and forever. It's not going away. You're either going to be exposed now, and I'm surprised if very many people haven't been exposed already, and you're either going to catch it or you won't, and you're either getting vaccinated or you're not. But either way, this thing is going through the entire world's population, and whatever future variants come out, if it follows the standard way that all diseases have followed in the past, it generally burns itself out. And so there is such a thing as herd immunity, as much as our health department wants to deny it. However, we've had viruses before. There's lots of viruses that we've had to deal with as a people, as a nation, and it is not unusual to have a virus, oftentimes some that are far worse than what we're facing now. Of course, the biggest damage, the biggest virus that we have that's really causing great harm in our country are the political class who's in charge, who thinks that they know everything, and they want to hype up the fear and ensure that everybody's living in this perpetual state of fear. And that is something that we're going to have to learn how to push back on. And I don't know what it takes. I mean, I think for everybody it's different, but the reality is some people are willing to live a life of consequence, and they're willing to have maybe a little bit more risk than others. So we accept that. At least until 18 months ago, we accepted that's decisions, life decisions that you could make. But the truth is all of us take risks and do dangerous things every day that may seem like it's worth it. We do cost-benefit analysis. Are we willing to get in the car? Are we willing to drive through Seattle traffic? Are we willing to drive across bridges in Washington State, whether they're floating or not? Even though Washington seems to have a terrible history with bridges collapsing and falling apart all the time, most of us are still willing to drive across them and hop in that car and drive because the cost-benefit analysis that we have in our mind is that even though there's a risk of death by traffic accident, thousands of people die that way every year, we're still willing to go out and do it. That's just how you live your life, cost-benefit analysis, something that's almost been entirely lost in this discussion in government policy as a reaction to the coronavirus issue. You know, the fear and the presumption of zero risk is the key to this control. And part of this, I think, comes from the fact that we just live in one of the best times in human history to ever be alive, with really long life expectancy, with modern medicine, with a lot of amazing wealth and opportunities and education and communication, all kinds of other things that have all come together to give us this ability to live a really pretty amazing life for most people in the world, and especially in America. And so it, I think, has made us think that we can live a life of zero risk, and that's just not realistic, not a life of consequence in any way. And in particular, if you live in the elite sort of spectrum that Governor Inslee and his other friends that he hobnobs with, right? They believe that zero risk is realistic, or at least that they can convince you that zero risk is realistic. And that produces the terrible policies that we have today, where they're actually creating, I think, a lot more harm with some of these policies than they're actually solving. I mean, there are ways that you can live a life of very little risk. You can cage yourself up and live that life with probably not too much risk, but is that a consequential life? And besides that, if you've done that, you decide to put your life in the hands of someone else. And unfortunately, that's what government policy has done for us. And the reality is, if you want to not get exposure to any virus or any other types of disease, perhaps you can dress up in full hazmat gear like this guy, and you can live a life dressed like that. It looks like some kind of utopian future. Nobody would think that's reasonable. But nevertheless, that's an option that exists for you. And 20 months ago, we would have thought that living with perpetual wearing a mask 100% of the time would be an unreasonable outcome. And yet, people are choosing to make those decisions. That's okay. If you want to live your life that way, I think that's fine. But you shouldn't be mandating that everybody else around you do the same. And ultimately, this really isn't about COVID-19 or the coronavirus or some kind of pandemic. It's about the way politicians and bureaucrats are using this as an excuse to influence and change and manipulate public policy. And when I say that, it's this idea that instantly your freedom and liberty can be tossed out the window by any excuse. A virus, and viruses have been around for a long time, many of them far more fatal and far more significant than the virus that we're living through today. And we don't instantly just burn our Constitution and throw away our liberty and freedoms. And it's been kind of funny because you've seen high-profile people, Arnold Schwarzenegger and others, who've gone out and said, hey, Fauci even saying, hey, to heck with your freedom and your liberty, that doesn't matter. My policies are what really matter. You have to follow my dictates. You have to decide what I want you to do. And that's a very elitist attitude, and it ignores the Bill of Rights and the freedoms that we really have won at great cost in human history, at a rare time in human history to even have these freedoms. And to be tossing them away so frivolously is something that we should all resist. And it's more than just the masks. Wear your mask if you think that's important, but don't force somebody else to wear it when they don't think that it matters to them. I think that that's the kind of issue when you're dictating these kind of policies. That's what generates more of the pushback than anything else. If masks work, they'd be working great. If they just make you feel good, if it just makes you feel like you're achieving something, go ahead, wear a mask. But I think, again, it's this idea of controlling and micromanaging everybody else that becomes part of the problem. And that the same issue ultimately really applies to the vaccines. Government policy has not done itself any favors when we find situations like they've had done in Washington where they've exaggerated the death by coronavirus by basically totally redoing the way the health systems ever looked at death rates and assigning deaths to people who actually didn't die of coronavirus. If you die of a gunshot or a car accident, that's how you died, not the coronavirus, even though you might have had it at the time. And so that, and this push on these vaccines, I think one of the reasons why you're seeing so many people push back is they aren't vaccines. They aren't functioning like a vaccine. People who are getting the shot are still getting the disease and they're hospitalized today. Every county in Washington state has somebody, usually a lot of people, who are vaccinated that have the disease and are on a ventilator or they're in the ICU right now. So that, when people see that and the attempt to kind of cover that up, is happening, you're going to have a lot of people wonder why they should get it when there's no benefit, when they still have to wear a mask, when they still have to be quarantined, when they still have to be worried about catching the disease. I do think that when you look at the stats, it looks like you're a little less likely to have as bad an outcome if you go to the hospital and you are vaccinated, but there's a lot of the stories coming out right now that it looks like the vaccine doesn't work the way it was promised. Because remember, we were all told if everyone got vaccinated, everything would go away. And that doesn't look like that's going to happen right now. However, it is very good for money for the pharmaceutical companies, and that's one of the reasons that people get suspicious. The majority of Americans are vaccinated. With herd immunity, I think that has been built up from the number of people that have already got the disease. The reality is most people have been exposed, and everyone will be exposed if they haven't been. I'd be surprised there's very many people out there that haven't been exposed in one way or another. It's a very infectious disease. But this push and saying you must, if it's so great, why do you have to push it so hard? It should be very obvious. So we're really running into a bad public policy situation. And bad public policy is what we see when the governors decided to take your business away. COVID-19 didn't take your business away. It might have in some cases if you had a travel agency or you had some business that was very directly affected by it, but most of the businesses that have failed in Washington State have failed because of the lockdown orders, not just because COVID showed up yesterday. So I think that the public policy is causing a lot more problems than it's solving, and it's one of the reasons why we have to be willing to look at it. And especially when we see this Governor Inslee, and he's not alone, there's plenty of other governors that are doing this as well, but they've decided that they want to make sure that you're going to be fearful and distracted as much as possible. So continually throwing out these new policies and more aggressive lockdown efforts, that is part of the plan. And it's really a bigger problem, and it's kind of masking, I think, a bigger problem here. You saw earlier this year Governor Inslee's willingness to use any excuse, no matter how exaggerated, to literally lock the entire state capitol down and prevent any citizen from accessing the capitol in any way at all, and also denying the legislature from being able to gather there and meet, and denying people from having access to their legislators. This is just, it's unprecedented. It's never happened before, and it was entirely out of proportion and ridiculous for it to happen. And it's because they don't like to have scenes like this. They didn't want to have people protesting during the legislative session. They didn't want to have people showing up when there were hearings and bills that were being discussed. Instead, they wanted to have the legislative session entirely by Zoom. And you're seeing, by the way, a lot of local governments doing the same thing for the same reasons. Holding your entire effort by Zoom, the only benefit you have is you have videos of the decision process. But the ability to have a public hearing like this by Zoom just means they hit the mute button and they get to silence everybody. Everybody they don't want to hear from, they get to silence, they get to control, they get to restrict that public comment. And if there's one thing that we've found that politicians and bureaucrats love, it's the ability to silence people and prevent them from having access to the political process. And we saw this very clearly in the legislative session. The heavy hand on the mute button, the denial of citizens from being able to go in and protest, and even know what was going on while all this other drama was going on about lockdowns. It's one of the reasons why we had so many terrible policies come out of this legislative session, I believe. People didn't have the ability to participate in the same way that they would have in the past. But really, in the end, it is all about the money, kicking the cash out to your friends. And politicians love doing this more than anybody else. There's nothing better than taking other people's money, your tax dollars, mine, or in the way the federal government treats it, and they give us kickbacks to the state, taking future generations' money or China's money, and just spreading it around like it's going out of style. These grant grifting schemes and kickback schemes to their friends are really a huge bonus for the political class. They like this. This is what they enjoy. This is what they like to do. And that, unfortunately, I think is the big picture behind the scenes here. Because after all, it's great to be king. It's great to be able to pretend like there's an emergency that never ends and that your endless lockdown policies, randomly changing all the time, you can use them to punish your enemies, to punish people you don't like. After all, I don't think Governor Inslee likes small businesses. They don't kick a lot of cash into his political campaign. He doesn't really care about them. They don't vote for him typically. So why not punish them? These are the problems that we have, and we can't keep living in fear because the lockdown's never going to end unless we're willing to push back, because we are never getting out of the lockdown unless we're willing to do that. And of course, what Governor Inslee and people like him in charge don't want us to put the spotlight on them. That's terrifying to them. And they don't want you to vote. They don't want you to participate. They want you to give up. Now, if you're in King County like this person was, perhaps you can even vote 12 times. And there's clearly a lot of problems with the election process. I've been involved in election integrity issues now for a long time, and this year in particular. And as we dig into problems we're going to have to fix in the state, that doesn't mean that you don't vote. It doesn't mean you don't participate in the political process. That's an incredibly small amount of time. Your 5 minutes that you're going to spend filling out that ballot, 10 minutes maybe if you're a little bit slower, that's really worth the time to put in. Is that too much to ask for to participate? Even if the system's flawed right now and we have to work on fixing it, it doesn't get better by you abandoning that process. Voting is important. And it's important because we will be kicking some of these politicians out of office. Hopefully the bad ones, and hopefully enough of them that it'll start to send a message. It requires you to be involved. It requires you to be engaged. Because in the end, the future does belong to those who show up. It belongs to us if we're willing to show up. If we're willing to go out there, spend the time, even if they're trying to censor us, even if they're trying to silence us, even if they're trying to distract us, living in fear is not a way to have a consequential life. But showing up and being there to make a difference is a way to make a consequential outcome in our state. I think those of us who care about freedom and liberty are willing to do it, And I hope you'll join with me. There's a lot of activities and events coming up in the future, and we're going to be reporting on those here at We the Govern in the future. You can read more about that at wethegovern.com. Please feel free to share this video with others, to subscribe to my website, but more importantly, encourage others to get involved. Don't be discouraged. Don't hide under a rock. It's not a good way to live. Living in fear is not what we need to be doing. We need to be pushing back and restoring the freedom and liberty that our government unfortunately wants to take away from us at any excuse they can find. Thank you so much for watching.